Terceris, a racist police officer, violently attacked a black woman not knowing who she was, and when he found out she was a judge, he fell into complete despair. Carlos, better known as Charlie Dixon, drove his patrol car through the streets of Atlanta, the afternoon sun filtering between the buildings and reflecting off his sunglasses. The radio crackled with routine calls, but nothing that really caught his attention. He was used to the monotony of patrols, the repetition of days, but something felt different that afternoon. As he approached a crowded parking lot, an urgent call interrupted his thoughts. Patrol 47, there's a disturbance in the Fifth Avenue parking lot. We need backup. Charlie sighed, already predicting it would be just another case of young people squabbling. Just another bunch of kids acting tough, he muttered to himself as he accelerated toward the location. Upon arrival, he spotted a group of young people standing around gesturing, and in the middle of them was a woman with a commanding presence. Her dark hair and upright posture stood out amid the chaos. Hey, what's going on here? Charlie asked, trying to take control of the situation. The woman, Luisa Mendez, turned to face him, her eyes filled with determination. We're discussing the racial discrimination that still permeates our society. It's important that voices be heard. Charlie frowned, feeling a wave of disdain. And you think this is going to solve anything? Kids, go home. You don't need to get into trouble with the police, he said, using the authoritative tone he was accustomed to. The young people began to murmur, and Luisa, sensing the tension, decided to intervene. We're not doing anything wrong. We're just trying to raise important issues about the unequal treatment we face. Charlie's anger began to boil. He wasn't prepared to hear a woman, especially someone who seemed so confident, challenge him. I think you don't understand your place. I'm the police here, and you need to be quiet, he growled, stepping toward Luisa. You can't silence me. That's exactly what we're trying to fight against. The abuse of power and oppression, Luisa replied, her voice firm and full of courage. The shock among the group of young people intensified. Some began recording the scene with their phones. Charlie, consumed by rage, grabbed Luisa by the arm and shoved her hard, causing her to fall to the ground. The sound of impact echoed, and he looked at her with contempt, his words sharp as they escaped his lips. You should know when to stop talking. Luisa found herself on the ground, dazed and hurt, not just physically but by the brutality of the act. The voices around her became a blur as humiliation enveloped her. The group of young people moved closer, some shouting in protest, others wide-eyed, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Charlie, on the other hand, stepped back, feeling satisfied with the control he had just exerted, ignoring the disapproving looks and the clicks of cameras. You can't do this, this isn't right, shouted one of the young people, but Charlie merely shook his head as if swatting away an annoying fly. He got into his car and started the engine, his heart racing but not out of remorse. He felt powerful, as if he had reaffirmed his position. As he drove away, the image of Luisa lying on the ground burned in his mind, but he forced himself to forget it, convincing himself that everything was under control. In the parking lot, Luisa struggled to her feet, the physical pain mixing with indignation. She knew she couldn't let this go. What had just happened was not just a personal attack, it was a reflection of a system that needed to be confronted. With the young people around her, she took a deep breath, determined not to be silenced. Luisa was shaken, her body still in shock from the brutality she had just suffered. The cold ground of the parking lot felt hard beneath her, but the sensation of an internal fire burned in her chest. She slowly stood up, feeling both the pain and the humiliation mingled with indignation. The image of Carlos Charlie Dixon, the officer who had assaulted her, was still fresh in her mind, and she knew she couldn't let this go unchallenged. With trembling hands, she took out her phone and dialed Ethan, her friend and civil rights attorney, someone who had always fought alongside her. The phone rang a few times before Ethan picked up, his concerned voice echoing on the other end. Luisa, what happened? Are you okay? Ethan, I had to call. I just got assaulted by a police officer, Luisa said, her voice choked. He pushed me and said horrible things. I need help. I can't let this go. Oh my God, Luisa, where are you? Ethan asked, his worry growing with each word. Are you hurt? I'm in the parking lot near the courthouse. It's all so confusing. I can't believe this happened, she replied, trying to keep calm. I need to sue him. We need to investigate the culture of abuse within the police department. Of course, I'll meet you there, and we'll talk about what to do next, Ethan said, deciding there was no time to waste. He hung up and quickly prepared to leave. Meanwhile, Charlie was in his car, driving through the streets of Atlanta, his mind in turmoil. He tried to rationalize his behavior, thinking up excuses and justifications for what he had just done. It was just a discussion, nothing serious, he murmured to himself, when in reality the echo of his racist words still resonated in his head. He had been taught to disregard the rights of minorities. That was how things had always worked in his life. Upon entering the precinct, Charlie headed to Sergeant Bill Rogers' office, his superior. Noticing Charlie's worried expression, Bill frowned. "What's wrong, Dixon? You look like a ghost." There was an incident. A Judge, Luisa Mendez, was in a disagreement with a group of young people. I pushed her. I didn't want it to happen, but she was challenging my authority," Charlie said, his voice trembling as he tried to explain the inexplicable. "You did what?" Bill asked, gripping his pen tightly. "You can't just assault someone, Charlie. This is a nightmare. We need to keep this under wraps. We can't let this spread." Charlie nodded, relieved to have someone on his side, even if it was just to cover up his actions. "I know, I'll keep it under control." As they spoke, Luisa anxiously awaited Ethan, her determination growing with each passing minute. When he finally arrived, the expression on his face showed he was ready to fight. "Luisa, we're going to take action. You can't let him get away with this. What you need is to gather witnesses, evidence, everything we can find," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes to make him pay for this," Luisa replied, a glimmer of determination reflecting in her gaze. "I need you to help me gather all the information about his behavior and the culture within the police. Let's get started right now. We can go to the location, talk to the witnesses. If there are any videos, we need to get them. And don't worry, I'll make sure you're not alone in this," Ethan said, giving her arm a supportive squeeze. Before we continue with this gripping story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories, and let us know which city you're watching this video from in the comments. This was a fight Luisa knew went beyond her own pain. It was about all those who had been silenced and oppressed. Courage surged within her, and the battle for justice was just beginning. Luisa and Ethan sat down at a table in a cafe, the strong aroma of fresh coffee filling the air around them. The place was bustling, but the small bubble they created seemed to isolate them from the outside world. With a determined expression, Luisa looked Ethan in the eye and said, "I can't let this go. We need evidence, witnesses, everything we can gather. The culture of abuse within the Atlanta police cannot continue to be ignored." Ethan, a skilled attorney with a background in civil rights cases, nodded, already thinking about the steps they needed to take. "You're right, Luisa, but we need to be careful. The police will try to discredit us in every possible way. We need willing witnesses to speak up. And above all, we need a plan. I know some people in the community who can help. Many of them have faced abuse and may be willing to share their stories," Luisa replied, her firm tone showing she wasn't willing to back down. "We need to let people know what really happens, that they're not alone." Meanwhile, outside, the city continued its routine, oblivious to what was unfolding behind the scenes. Charlie, in his patrol car, drove through the streets of Atlanta, his mind in turmoil. The adrenaline from that night still pulsed through his veins, but it was now accompanied by a growing weight of regret. He remembered Luisa's look, the shock on her face, and the sound of her voice trying to defend herself. "What have I done?" he murmured to himself, banging his hand on the steering wheel. "What happened to me?" His thoughts were interrupted when his radio crackled. It was Sergeant Bill Rogers. "Dixon, come to the station. We need to talk about the incident from last night." Bill's voice sounded authoritative, and Charlie felt a chill in his stomach. He knew he needed support, but the prospect of meeting Bill made him uneasy. "Yes, Sergeant. On my way," he replied, his voice weaker than he would have liked. That same afternoon, Luisa and Ethan went to a community organization where they met with a group of local activists. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and everyone knew something had to change. Luisa took the lead, feeling the energy in the room. "We need courage. We need to unite to fight against this police brutality. What happened to me is not an isolated case, and we must fight against it together." The faces around her were a mix of determination and fear. An older man, with visible scars on his hands, stood up. "I'm not afraid to speak out. I've been wrongfully arrested by police who acted like they were gods. If you need witnesses, I'm here." "I will too," said a woman, her voice trembling but firm. "My son was assaulted by an officer just because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. We can't stay silent." Luisa felt a knot form in her throat. "Thank you. Together, we can show the world the truth. The police need to be held accountable for their actions. Meanwhile, Charlie was trying to find solace in his conversation with Bill. The sergeant sat behind his desk, his expression serious. "You need to stay out of the spotlight, Dixon. What happened was a mistake, yes, but we can't let this spread. It's better if you don't say anything to anyone." "But what about the witnesses and the video they have?" Charlie asked, his heart racing. "We can't just ignore this. We'll do whatever it takes to protect our image." "You're not thinking of speaking up, are you?" Bill said with a piercing gaze. "Because if you do, you'll find yourself in trouble, and I won't be able to help you." The pressure was mounting, and Charlie felt like he was falling into an abyss. He knew what he had done was wrong, but the fear of losing everything he had kept him trapped. Meanwhile, Louisa and Ethan continued their mission, determined to expose the truth and fight for justice. The city of Atlanta, with its troubled past, was about to awaken to a new reality, and Louisa was ready to be the voice that would echo for all those who had been silenced. The atmosphere in Atlanta was charged with tension and anticipation. Louisa Mendez's case had spread like wildfire throughout the city, and protests in support of her were boiling over on every corner. The streets, once silent, were now filled with cries for justice and slogans demanding change. Louisa, amid all this, felt a growing weight on her shoulders, but also a renewed determination. On a sunny morning, Louisa met with Ethan at a busy cafe downtown. The aroma of fresh coffee and the hustle and bustle around them couldn't dissipate the seriousness of their mission. "Ethan, we need to do something big. We can't let what happened to me be just another story with no consequences," she said, her voice firm, but with a slight tremor of emotion. Ethan nodded, his gaze intense. "I agree. We need to gather the community, give voice to those who have also suffered at the hands of police brutality. If we can mobilize people, maybe we can force the police to be accountable." Louisa smiled, encouraged by his words. "I want to organize a community meeting. We need people to share their stories, to see that they're not alone. This will shine a light on our case." The idea took shape quickly. In the following days, Louisa and Ethan worked tirelessly, distributing flyers and using social media to call the public to gather. When the day finally arrived, the community auditorium was packed. People of all ages and backgrounds came together, all united by a common purpose: to seek justice and expose corruption within the Atlanta police. Louisa stepped onto the stage, her heart racing. The murmurs of the crowd quieted as she began to speak. "Today we are here not just for me, but for all those who have been silenced, who have suffered at the hands of those who were supposed to protect them," she declared, her voice echoing in the hall. "It is time to unmask the culture of abuse that hides under the mantle of authority." Her words resonated among those present, and a man stood up, his voice trembling with emotion. "I was assaulted by the police 2 years ago, but I never had the courage to speak out. What happened to you made me realize I can no longer remain silent." Hearing this, Louisa felt her heart warm. "You are not alone," she replied, "and your courage inspires others to speak. Together, we are stronger." The meeting transformed into a powerful testament of resistance. Each shared account was a brick in the construction of a truth that could no longer be ignored. Louisa saw tears in many eyes, but also a spark of hope. What had once been a whisper was now a collective shout for justice. Meanwhile, across the city, Charlie Dixon faced his own demons. Isolated and tormented by guilt, he watched the coverage of the meeting on television. The faces of citizens clamoring for justice were a constant reminder of what he had done. A co-worker, Mark, entered the room, interrupting his thoughts. "Charlie, you need to forget this. It's not worth getting involved," Mark said, trying to minimize the gravity of the situation. "How can I forget?" Charlie replied, his voice low but full of pain. "I assaulted her. Look at what's happening. This is bigger than I imagined." Mark hesitated, realizing the depth of Charlie's internal struggle. "You're a good cop, Charlie. Just try not to let this consume you." But Mark's words brought no comfort. Charlie knew his loyalty was being tested, and that regardless of what happened, the consequences of his actions would be harsh and unforgiving. Back at the meeting, Louisa was aware that the movement was growing. The community's support made her feel stronger, and she began planning a press conference to expose police brutality and the corruption permeating the police force. "I can't stay silent any longer," she told Ethan as they organized the details. "It's time to step up and make a difference." Ethan smiled, admiring Louisa's determination. "You're ready for this, Louisa. The world needs to hear your story." Meanwhile, the city of Atlanta was preparing for a confrontation that would go beyond the courtroom and the law. It was a fight for the truth, a cry for justice that would echo through the streets and the consciences of all who lived there. Louisa was nervous, but resolute. The press room was filled with journalists, cameras, and reporters, eager to hear what she had to say. With the spotlight shining on her face, she took a deep breath and prepared to make her statement. Beside her, Ethan supported her, his gaze firm and encouraging. He knew this moment was crucial not only for Louisa, but for everyone who had suffered at the hands of police brutality. "Good afternoon, everyone," Louisa began, her voice resonating through the room. "Today I am here not only to talk about what happened to me, but to expose a system that has fed on fear and oppression. The assault I suffered is just the tip of the iceberg of a culture of abuse that needs to be dismantled." The cameras buzzed, capturing every word. The reporters leaned forward, eager for more details. Louisa continued, her passion growing with each phrase. "I am not the only one to have faced this brutality. Many voices have been silenced, and it is our duty to bring them to light. This fight is not just mine, it is all of ours." The murmur in the room increased as Louisa spoke about the experiences of other citizens who had been mistreated by the police. She mentioned specific cases, citing names and stories that deeply touched her. Maria, a 17-year-old student, was unjustly assaulted by a group of police officers. He was just holding a book. What happened to him could have happened to any of us. As Louisa spoke, Charlie watched the conference at home. The tension in his body was palpable. He felt torn, caught between loyalty to his colleagues and the growing awareness that his actions were unacceptable. The weight of guilt was becoming unbearable. How did I get to this point? He wondered. What I did is not who I am, or is it? Back in the press room, Louisa concluded with a heartfelt appeal. We are here to demand change. We can no longer allow police brutality to continue unchecked. We need reforms, we need accountability, and above all, we need justice. Her voice was firm, and the heat of her words seemed to ignite those present. Applause began to rise, first timidly, then growing in intensity. The journalists were on their feet, some shouting questions, others shouting words of support. The room was electric, but Louisa knew this was just the first battle in a much larger war. Charlie turned off the television, feeling paralyzed. He couldn't take his eyes off the screen, where Louisa was defending not just herself, but the dignity of all those who had been wronged. He wondered if there was still time to change, to redeem himself. But the image of Louisa and her fierce determination haunted him. "I can't stay silent," he whispered to himself, his mind racing with the idea that perhaps, just perhaps, his regret could lead him down a path of redemption. In the press room, Ethan approached Louisa after her statement, his eyes shining. "You were amazing, Louisa. What you did today could change everything. People need to hear this." "I hope so," Louisa replied, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "But I know we are just getting started. The pressure is mounting, and we need to be ready for what comes next." Ethan nodded, his expression turning serious. "I think Charlie is in a delicate position. He could become an ally, or an even bigger adversary." "We can't trust him," Louisa said, her gaze determined. "We need to focus on the fight for justice and the necessary reforms. That is more important than any personal reconciliation." The room was in a frenzy, but Louisa and Ethan knew that the true battle was just beginning. Public pressure on the police was rising, and they were determined to turn popular outrage into concrete action. Meanwhile, Charlie, isolated in his world of regret, questioned his future and what it truly meant to be a police officer. Louisa and Ethan met at a cozy cafe, their tables close to the window, where sunlight filtered through the glass, creating an ambiance that contrasted with the gravity of the situation they faced. Louisa, with a determined expression, looked at the open laptop in front of her, while Ethan reviewed a folder of documents. The atmosphere was tense, but hope still shone in their eyes. "We need more evidence," Louisa said, running her hands through her hair, a nervous gesture that betrayed the pressure she felt. "If we can find more witnesses, we can build an even stronger case against Charlie." Ethan nodded, his face serious. "You're right. We need a video or something that shows the assault, not just testimonies. People need to see what happened." As they discussed strategies, a text message from a friend of Louisa's popped up on her phone. It was a video recording sent by one of the young people who had been in the parking lot during the incident. Her heart raced. "Ethan, look at this." He leaned in to see the screen. The video showed the scene of the assault, capturing the moment Charlie pushed Louisa to the ground. The image was shocking, and the audio captured his words of hatred. "This is perfect," Ethan exclaimed, his mind already working on how to use this evidence. "We need to make sure it's not deleted or lost," Louisa said, adrenaline surging. "We need to make copies and distribute it to the media." "Yes, and let's reach out to human rights organizations. This could turn into something much bigger than just an individual case," Ethan suggested, excited about the prospect. With the video in hand, Louisa and Ethan began contacting journalists and activists. The movement surrounding Louisa's case was growing, and she felt increasingly like a spokesperson for the fight against police brutality. The pressure on the Atlanta police was mounting, and Louisa knew she needed to be strong, not just for herself, but for all those who had suffered in silence. Meanwhile, Charlie was at home, consumed by guilt. He couldn't shake the image of Louisa lying on the ground from his mind. What he had done was undeniable, and even with Bill's support, his conscience tormented him. He remembered the words his mother used to say in childhood, "Respect everyone, Charlie. Everyone has their story." But those lessons seemed so distant now. "You've gone too far, man," Charlie murmured to himself, looking in the bathroom mirror. "How could you do this?" He picked up his phone, hesitating, and decided to call Bill. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice trembling. "What's the problem, Dixon?" Bill replied with a tone of disdain, as if he wasn't interested in Charlie's moral conflicts. I don't know if I can keep going like this. What I did was wrong, and now, with everything happening, I feel trapped. Listen, you need to keep your mouth shut. What you did was a mistake, but it's not the end of the world. If you stay quiet, this will blow over. Do you think people care about an isolated incident? This is nothing compared to what we've seen," Bill said, trying to comfort Charlie, but the words sounded empty. "But what if people find out? What if Louisa gets what she wants? This could open a Pandora's box for all of us," Charlie replied, his voice almost pleading. "That's not going to happen, I promise. Just keep quiet and do your job. The last thing we need is for you to become a victim in this story," Bill concluded, hanging up before Charlie could respond. Dejected, Charlie sat on his bed, feeling more isolated than ever. The echoes of his childhood lessons rang in his mind, but now reality forced him to confront who he truly was. At the same time, Louisa was finding her strength. She and Ethan were about to meet with a group of activists, planning an event that would attract media attention, and possibly the nation. The fight was just beginning, but Louisa was determined not to let her voice be silenced. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere charged with tension and anticipation. Bright lights reflected off the anxious faces of those present as Louisa prepared to present her case. She could feel the weight of the nation's gaze upon her. Each breath echoed the importance of that hearing. Ethan, beside her, wore a confident expression, but the concern in his eyes could not be disguised. "Remember what we talked about, Louisa. The truth is your greatest weapon," he whispered before she stood up. She nodded, taking a deep breath to calm her nerves. The judge entered the room, banging the gavel, and the audience fell silent. All eyes on Louisa as she rose with a mix of determination and vulnerability. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Louisa began, her voice steady. "I am not just here seeking personal justice today. I am here for all those who, like me, have been silenced and assaulted by those who are supposed to protect us." Her eyes sparkled with passion as she looked directly at Charlie, who sat to her left, his head bowed, unable to bear the weight of her gaze. "I am a federal judge, and while my position gives me a platform, my fight is for all citizens facing abuse of power. What happened to me is not an isolated case. It is part of a pattern that needs to be exposed." She paused, allowing her words to resonate in the room. Ethan, in the background, nodded to the first witness, a young man who had been assaulted by police in a similar situation. "Can you tell us what happened that night?" he asked, his voice clear and controlled. The young man took a deep breath and began recounting his experience. "I was just coming home when I was stopped by 2 police officers. They started interrogating me for no reason. When I asked to call my lawyer, one of them shoved me and threw me to the ground. I did nothing to deserve that." The room fell silent, the gravity of the situation settling into every heart present. Louisa observed Charlie's expression, which was now paler, guilt beginning to show on his face. "Thank you," Ethan said before calling the next witness, a middle-aged woman who had a similar story. "You were also a victim of police abuse, weren't you?" She nodded, tears in her eyes. "Yes, once I was just discussing an issue in my neighborhood, and the police showed up and pushed me. I just wanted to be heard." "And did you feel safe after that incident?" Ethan asked. "Not at all. I always look over my shoulder now. I don't trust the police anymore," she replied, her voice trembling. Louisa felt her heart tighten with each testimony, the pain and indignation growing. It was a vicious cycle that needed to be broken. She turned to the judge and with renewed courage declared, "These are not just isolated stories. There is a pattern that needs to be confronted. What happened to me and these people is clear evidence of a culture of abuse and impunity within the police force." Charlie, seated in his place, struggled against the avalanche of emotions. He remembered his childhood, the distorted teachings that shaped him. Now he was faced with the truth, and the heavy weight of his conscience consumed him. He wondered if there was still time for redemption. The next piece of evidence presented by Ethan was a video showing Charlie's assault on Louisa, filmed by a bystander. The room fell silent as the video played, the brutal images revealing the reality of what had happened. Louisa watched, feeling a mix of anger and relief. It was the proof she needed to validate her fight. "This is the moment to confront the truth," Ethan said as the video concluded. "We need to hold accountable those who abuse their power. What you did, Charlie, is not just a personal issue. It is a systemic failure that must be corrected. And this room is the first step." The murmurs in the audience grew, and Louisa felt the tide beginning to turn. She looked at Charlie, who was now visibly shaken, his expression revealing that he was starting to understand the gravity of his actions. "I am not just seeking justice for myself. I am seeking justice for everyone," Louisa concluded, her voice resonating with unwavering strength as the room erupted in applause. The battle was just beginning, but she was determined to fight for every silenced voice. The courtroom was in absolute silence. The tension in the air was palpable, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for what Luisa Mendez, the federal judge who had become a symbol of resistance, had to say. She stood up, her gaze firm and determined, as the judge invited her to make her closing statement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Louisa began, her voice resonating with a power that seemed to echo against the courtroom walls. "Today, I am not here merely to seek justice for myself. I am here for all those who have been silenced, assaulted, and dehumanized by the abuse of power." She paused, allowing her words to penetrate the minds of every listener. "One of us could easily have been the next to suffer at the hands of a system that fails to protect its citizens," Louisa continued, gesturing passionately. "Today we face the truth about police brutality, about the culture of fear that has taken hold in our community. What happened to me was not an isolated act. It was part of a pattern that needs to be exposed and fought against." In the audience, many leaned forward, absorbing every word. The looks of support and solidarity were visible, reinforcing the importance of that moment. Louisa glanced at Charlie, who was sitting to the right of the judge, his expression confused and filled with regret. He seemed a shadow of the man who had acted with such rage and disdain. "I am not here just to ask for my own justice," Louisa continued, with an emotion that overflowed from her being. "I am here for every mother who fears for her child's safety, for every father who worries when he sees his son leave home. Injustice can no longer be ignored. We need change, we need reform, and we need a system that truly serves and protects everyone." Charlie, listening to her words, felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He remembered his childhood, the lessons he had been taught about minorities, and now he found himself confronted with the reality of what he had become. He knew there was no way to go back, but for a moment, he wished he could have done things differently. Louisa continued, now more fervently. "I believe we all have the capacity to change. We can all choose to be better, and for that reason, I make an appeal to you, Charlie. Change begins within us. Acknowledge your mistake. Recognize the pain you have caused. Do not hide behind your badge or the culture you embraced. Face it, and perhaps, just perhaps, you can begin the process of redemption." Louisa's words hit Charlie like a blow. He felt the weight of his own ignorance and the depth of the pain he had inflicted on her and so many others. Louisa, without averting her gaze, seemed to be waiting for a response from him, but he was paralyzed, grappling with his own emotions. "Louisa, Charlie finally stood up, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to apologize. What I did was horrible, and I have no words to describe how deeply sorry I am. I let my prejudice speak louder, and that made me a person I never wanted to be." She looked at him, her expression firm yet touched with compassion. "Words are just the beginning, Charlie. True change happens through actions, You need to confront your own truth and work to change not just yourself, but also the system that allowed this to happen. The judge, observing the emotional exchange between the two, asked everyone to calm down, but the room was still charged with conflicting feelings. Louisa, with a strong voice, made one last appeal. Today, we are not just here to decide Charlie's fate, but to shape the future of our community. May we be remembered not just for this case, but for the movement it represents. May we be the generation that finally says enough to the abuse of power and discrimination. As she concluded her statement, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, and the people in the audience began to murmur, fully aware of the magnitude of what was at stake. The moment was crucial, and the echo of Louisa's words would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension, and the silence was almost tangible. The room was filled with people, all eyes fixed on the judge, who was preparing to make the announcement that everyone awaited with bated breath. Luisa Mendez, standing there, felt her heart race. She had faced so many challenges to get to this point, and now the possibility of justice seemed within her grasp. The judge, with an impassive expression, finally spoke. "Carlos Dixon, you are found guilty of assault and abuse of power." The words echoed through the room, and a clamor of applause erupted among the attendees. Louisa felt a wave of relief and empowerment wash over her. It was as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She looked out at the audience and saw smiling faces, people who had supported her throughout her journey, and that filled her with courage. "This is for all of us," shouted a woman from the crowd, and soon others joined in, shouting words of support and celebration. Louisa couldn't hold back her tears. It was a victory not just for her, but for everyone who had suffered under oppression and police brutality. She turned to Ethan, her lawyer, who was standing beside her, and saw him smiling, his eyes shining with pride and satisfaction. "We did it, Ethan. We did it," she exclaimed, gripping his hand tightly. Meanwhile, Carlos Charlie Dixon was in a state of shock. He stood frozen, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The judge's words echoed in his mind, but he couldn't process everything that was happening. What had seemed like a routine patrol had turned into a nightmare, and now he was being taken into custody, a man marked by shame and guilt. I didn't want this to happen," he murmured, almost a whisper as the police led him away, the handcuffs gleaming under the courtroom lights. Louisa, still caught up in the euphoria of victory, couldn't help but look at him. There was a sadness in her heart for everything he could have been if he had chosen a different path. "You had the chance to do the right thing, Charlie," she said, her voice firm but filled with compassion. "But you chose the path of violence and hatred. Now you'll have to live with that." Her words echoed the struggle she had fought, and each syllable seemed to affirm her own strength. Charlie turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. "Louisa, he began, but the words failed him. He knew nothing he said could justify his actions. "I'm sorry," was all he managed to utter, his voice barely audible. "Apologies aren't enough," she replied firmly, watching him be led away. "You'll have to face the consequences of your behavior." As the room continued to celebrate Charlie's conviction, Louisa felt enveloped by a wave of love and support. She knew the fight was far from over, but this moment was a milestone. Looking back at Ethan, she realized he was living that moment with her, sharing in the joy and hope for a better future. "You're a hero, Louisa," Ethan exclaimed, wrapping her in a tight embrace. "This is just the beginning. You've inspired so many people today, and we still have a lot to do," she replied, looking around the room, where people were still applauding and shouting words of support. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has been silenced. We need to ensure this doesn't happen again." The judge stood up, interrupting the applause, but the atmosphere of hope and renewal was palpable. Louisa knew she had a long road ahead, but that day she had taken a crucial step toward change. And as Charlie left the courtroom, he couldn't escape the feeling that perhaps everything he had done could have been different if only he had chosen to listen instead of acting out of anger. The courtroom was in turmoil, with the murmur of the media and the whispers of the audience blending into a cacophony of emotions. Louisa, still absorbing the magnitude of Charlie's conviction, could not imagine that the story was about to take an even more dramatic turn. Amidst the intense media coverage, a new video had surfaced, bringing with it the possibility of an even greater scandal. When local reporter Sarah Collins entered the room, her gaze was determined. "Folks, we have a bombshell update," she announced, her voice resonating with the adrenaline of discovery. We received an anonymous video showing Sergeant Bill Rogers actively participating in cover-ups of police assaults. This video could change everything. Louisa, who was chatting with Ethan beside her, froze upon hearing Bill's name. "What do you mean by cover-ups?" she questioned, her voice filled with disbelief. Ethan, who had already heard rumors about Bill's corruption, looked at Louisa with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "If this is true, Louisa, we could take down the entire corrupt structure that allowed Charlie and others to act with impunity." As the audience clustered to watch the video, the tension in the courtroom mounted. Louisa's eyes were glued to the screen as the footage began to play. It was an outdoor scene captured by a cell phone, showing Bill talking with a group of police officers in a dark alley. "You know what to do. If anyone asks, nothing happened. Protect yourselves and I'll take care of you," Bill said, with a tone of disdain that made it clear he was aware of the atrocities being committed. The murmurs in the room grew louder, and Louisa couldn't contain her outrage. "This is it! He's the real culprit behind all of this," she shouted, standing up as the judge tried to restore order. The audience responded with applause, Louisa's passion resonating in every corner of the courtroom. "Silence, order must be maintained," the judge barked, but it was too late. The scandal had been exposed and social media began to swell with the hashtag #OkaJustice4Louisa, quickly turning into a viral movement. However, Charlie's reaction to the video was very different. He watched the scene from his cell, tears streaming down his face. "Bill, you used me," he murmured, the truth settling in his mind like a sharp blade. He realized that while he thought he was defending a cause, he had been a pawn in a much larger game. The following weeks were frenetic. Bill was arrested on charges of corruption and cover-up, and Louisa found herself at the center of a national movement for police reform. At a press conference surrounded by supporters and reporters, Louisa spoke fervently. "This isn't just my fight, but the fight of every citizen who has suffered under oppression. We need change, and we won't stop until it happens." Ethan, at her side, added, "The truth is powerful, and now we have the opportunity to change the narrative. We cannot allow corruption to continue to thrive within the police force." As Louisa became a public figure, Charlie found himself increasingly isolated, reflecting on his life and the choices that led him to that cell. He remembered moments from his childhood, how he was taught to see minorities as enemies, and the pain of losing the possibility of redemption weighed heavily on him. "I could have made a difference," he whispered to himself, the solitude wrapping around him like a shadow. The movement for police reform was gaining momentum, and Louisa, now a recognized advocate for civil rights, began planning a new organization dedicated to overseeing police actions and promoting accountability. In a meeting with activists, she stood up and said, "The fight doesn't end here. Each of us has a role to play. Together, we can ensure that justice prevails." And so, while the world watched Louisa's transformation into a leader, Charlie pondered his choices and the cost of his ignorance. The true struggle for justice and change was just beginning, and although Louisa had achieved a victory, the battle against oppression and injustice continued. The echoes of the past still resonated, but the hope for a more just future began to shine, and Louisa was determined to be the light that would guide the way. We've come to the end of this moving story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more tales like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Right now, there's a playlist of videos on your screen. If you want to keep watching these touching stories, just click on it to dive in. And now, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from and leave a like to support our work. Now, a sincere question. Do you agree with what happened in the story? We want to hear your opinion. Until the next video.